I don't imagine you like sand. If you're like me, I don't imagine you like sanding. But if you're interested in tips, tricks, and techniques on sanding that'll help you make you a more efficient and more effective sander, keep watching. Why do we sand? Well, our final finish on a product is only going to be as good as how we've prepared the wood. As much as we'd like to think that putting finish on is going to cover up our sanding errors, it doesn't work that way. The goal is to get your final wood bowl, whatever, cut as cleanly as possible with a sharp edge before we get to sanding. That is, try to eliminate any tool marks. You may not get all of them, but there's some of them you can cut out by sharpening your tool, taking a second pass. So try to work at getting the best possible surface you can off your tool before you get to sanding, and it'll save some sanding and avoid some sanding dust. You want to take the object by a window or use some harsh raking light that comes down from the side that will highlight through shadows any torn grain or tear out that you might have on your workpiece. The first goal is we're going to get rid of any tool marks by using a coarser grit, and if we can't eliminate that coarse, you've got to use that coarser grit, and you've got to eliminate those tool marks. After the first grit and you've eliminated tool marks, the other grits are only removing the sanding scratches from the previous grit. So if we start with 80, 100, 120, remove the tool marks, and then after that you're going to go up in increments of 50. So 120 to 180, 180 to about 240, 240 to about 320. After that, depends on the wood, you might go up to 400, you might go up to 600 or higher in some instances. I want to share 5 sanding tips that I got from Russ Fairfield, who was a noted wood turner who passed away a few years ago. The number one rule is use the sandpaper as a cutting tool. That is, if it's not sharp, it's not going to cut. Use it like somebody else is paying for it, and don't feel like you got to keep using it until it's completely worn out. When it gets dull, pitch it. Rule 2, refine the shape and remove all the tool marks, torn grain, as much as possible with that coarse grit at the very beginning before you move on to finer grits. You're going to repair that surface with as coarse a grit as necessary, but only as coarse as necessary. If you can accomplish it with 120, use 120. If it takes 80, use 80 grit. Rule number 3, sand through all the grits progressively and don't skip a grit. So as I mentioned before, you go from 120 to 180. Some people will go through 150, and that's fine before they go to 180. From 180, you're going to go to 220 or 240, then again up to 320, 400, and 600. Generally, I will stop with most utility pieces at 320. If it's a finer piece, I might go up to 400. Most instances, I don't go up past 400 unless I'm using some kind of exotic wood or doing a finial with ebony or something where every little scratch does show up, and in that case you can take it up to 600, 800. Rule number 4, remove all the scratches from the previous grit before you move to the next grit. Again, examine it under a coarse light and make sure you've eliminated that previous grit scratches, because going to a finer grit, it'll just make it harder, and you may never get down below that level of that previous grit. Number 5, speed is slow, and slower is even better. There's a universal tendency to sand too fast. When you sand too fast, several things happen. Number 1, the sandpaper or the disc can skate over the surface. Number 2, as a result of that, they're just not digging in and they're not doing their job. The other issue is sanding too fast, is you can create excessive heat, and that can cause heat checks on some wood, and you can burnish the wood. If your slowest speed on your lathe is 500, then sand at 500. If you're doing a large bowl though and you've got a larger lathe, probably you want to step down to something even slower, 200. And you don't want to turn your disc sander on at the fastest speed. You want to slow it down a little bit as well. Okay, there's a dizzying array of wide variety of abrasives, and let me just show you a few. First of all, let's deal with paper. You know, paper comes in, can come in rolls. As I told you, especially if you get this from Klingspor in a bargain box. And it comes from sheets. You can buy it in a pack. Obviously, different grits. If you go to an automotive store, you can get some very high grits. I think you can buy sheets individually. The backing varies quite a bit. You can go from a cloth back that's somewhat stiff to one that's, you know, a sanding belt off your sander cloth that's very, very high. The paper, you know, most of this stuff here, it might be high quality paper, but if it's backed by paper, it limits your opportunity to, for example, do wet sanding, because it just won't hold up as paper. You need to have a cloth backed. Now, when it comes to discs, they tend to be Velcro back, but you can also get them in a PSA, pressure sensitive. Now, these tend to be in some type of synthetic back that holds up a long time. The finer ones sometimes in some type of mylar base. You can also get sheets in with a foam back. These were sample pack. I don't know what I use them for. You can get sanding sticks in certain grits, and you can wash them and reuse them, or you can make your own. These are some 2-inch snap-ons that I'd gotten with my used lathe. I've had them 11 years. I never was real happy with this particular product. It was awfully stiff, much stiffer than the typical mandrel with a foam back and a interface pad. Another type of abrasive, somewhat new, and thanks again to Ken Gunnell for sending me a sample of Abranet. And basically, it's got a mesh, and it works great for, especially for wet sanding. And then Woodturners Wonders has an equivalent product called Wonder Weave that's built on the same similar specifications. It's an open mesh that contains thousands of small holes. It's an aluminum oxide grain resin bonded to a durable and long-lasting fabric. It'll clean easily. You can either blow it out by air, you can tap it on a hard surface if it's just dust, or you can wash it. It produces a very uniform sanding pattern and perfectly smooth surface. It performs great for wet sanding or with green wood, as well as dry wood, and simply will not clog like other abrasives. And you can get it in sheets, or you can get it, as woodturners like to have it, in discs. Although it's not as likely to go through it if it's backed by, you know, with a backing like you'd have on a disc sander. But you can pull them off and clean them. And they also come in circular pads that you can get, the Velcro bats. But again, that weave allows you to, if you're doing a wet sanding or process, you can clean these out and reuse them. So another sanding product is non-abrasive pad or synthetic steel wool. I don't tend to use these much. I use these for getting rid of frizzies on texturing. I've got some finer grit, but I haven't figured out what to do with them, the white ones. The other one works great for pin turners, but I've also found it useful for doing the inside of a bowl that you can't easily get to a Beal buffing system, and that's this micro mesh. You go through all these meshes on the inside of a bowl, and you will really clean up shine that surface almost as if it had been done on a buffing system. Basically, if it's an outside of a bowl, you don't need to do this because it's faster and easier to use the Beal buff with the Triple E white diamond than it is to use this. Here's a chart of the micro mesh. Lets you know how far it goes. It goes from 1500 up to all the way up to 12,000. Let me talk about cheap sandpaper. Don't buy it. The kind of stuff you get from Harbor Freight. I found this one example made in China. So it's going to have a very cheap paper backing, and it's got a grit on it that there's no telling what it is. They could have gone out and bought a bucket full of sand and glued it on there for that matter. But it's not going to be as uniform. Quality costs money. Quality control costs money. Quality ingredients cost money, and this is not quality. So avoid cheap sandpaper made in China like the plague. Another product I picked up at Harbor Freight years ago, before I got into wood turning, there's these sanding sponges. This is a fine grit, says it's comparable to 150 to 220. I'm not sure where this fits in wood turning, but it is an abrasive product, so I'll mention it. When it comes to cloth belts, there's three different classifications. There's the X, which is very stiff, like on these belt sander discs, and frankly they're not real practical for wood turning on that. Most of the stuff I get from Klingspor is either a J or a J Flex or an X Flex. And the Flex are flexible versions, and I haven't found big differences in the flexibility between in this case, a J Flex, which I find to be a really good cloth, easy to maneuver, and the X Flex. X is a little bit stiffer, but not noticeably so. Then you also have a Y, which I find is a little bit like the X. It's pretty stiff, and I haven't run into that on too many of the grits. Most sandpaper that we as wood turners are going to use are based on a European standard. It's pre-designated with P, and it comes typically in a 60, 80 grit, 120, 150, 180, 220, 240, 280, 320, 400, 600, and 800. Now, typically, you don't want to skip grits, and most likely you're going to start with a 120 grit, occasionally an 80 grit, maybe. Then you're normally going to skip the 150. Depending on the wood, you might, if you got 150, you might hit it as well. But normally, 50% increments. 50% of 120 is 60. 120 plus 60 is 180. So you go from 120 to 180. Then typically you're going to go to 240. Then you're going to go to 320. And then you may stop there, or you may go up to 400, 600, or 800, depending on what you're turning. Let's talk sanding safety. One of the easiest measures is to have a fan that's able to blow the dust away from you. And we're not talking, shavings are not the problem. It's the sanding dust. And the larger items you turn, the less clean you get the cut, the more you have to sand. So that can be a very effective solution. If you've got a shop that has got a big, large, like in a garage, you can open up your door and a fan can be very effective. In a closed-in shop, having an overhead air cleaning unit can be a very helpful thing. Anytime you're sanding, turn it on and let it run for a couple hours afterwards. It is not a fail-safe system. You still need to have some other type of dust collection mechanism. Collecting dust at the lathe, again, not shavings. It helps if you have some type of hood or some way that you can actually pull that dust in while you're sanding with a dust collection system. I'm not going to get into details on dust collection. Generally, a shop vac is not an adequate dust collection system. It's the very fine particles of dust that you can't see that are a problem. So your first or last line of defense, depending on what your solution is, it could be a mask like a dust begone. Frankly, these are fairly comfortable and easy to wear. Not sure how effective they are, They're certainly better than these various nuisance masks, which are virtually useless. This is a Harbor Freight surgical mask. It helps, but it does do a lot. A personal air filtration, powered air filtration unit tends to work fairly well if you use it. And I'm here to tell you, I don't use this as often as I could, so I'm probably not the best messenger to preach that particular message. If you got the location and you got the good weather, sanding outside is always a very pleasant option on a task that otherwise wouldn't be a lot of fun, and it's a lot safer not having to breathe the dust. When you're sanding on the lathe, first and foremost, remove the tool rest. Get it out of the way, because it's just something that's going to cause you interference or possibly cause you to get between your turning and the tool rest, and that's not a good thing. Don't ever use rags. If you've got a bowl like this one, this is just an example with a void or a bark inclusion, it can snatch that rag out and pull you into it. Don't ever wrap something like that around your fingers, because you're really asking for it then. But much better to use a kitchen paper, I think as they say down in Australia, or paper towel as we say in the USA, because if it catches, it'll just rip out of your hands or rip apart. So that's an important consideration. If you're turning something very small, such as a box that you can barely get 2 fingers in, it's too small to put 2 fingers in. Even Richard Raffin has hurt himself by getting his fingers caught, and it's not a pleasant thing. So there are other solutions. One is using a hemostat. This one's a little small. If you do use a hemostat, don't ever stick your fingers in there. Same thing, it can get snatched. Grab it like this, so if it gets away from you, it's going to get pulled out of your hands. Or come up and make you some sanding sticks. I'm still looking for a good way to come up with something for the inside of a box. So if anybody's got any ideas, post them in the comments below. Let's talk about sanding accessories. I think the major one is what they call a close quarters drill. Again, it's a drill, not a sander, but this works just great on bowls and larger objects. These are both from Harbor Freight. I started with this one about 11 years ago. It's a keyed one. It works fine. It's got the very same specifications pretty much as this other one, which cost about $10 more, which is a keyless. This one, they were running a sale on it, so I bought this one and retired this one. They both work well. I would go with the keyless one. Just makes it a lot easier to change things out. With your 20% off coupon, this one's about $30. This is about $24. It's interesting. There are some other sanders or close quarter drills out there that might have better controls in that they're easier to slow down or speed up. This one, you could drill a hole in it and put a pin in it to keep you from going too fast. One of the things I like about both these models, which I think is pretty good design, is they have the air intake down near the bottom as opposed to up here like some of them. So they seem to have a long life, because I've been using this one for 10 years. I'm not a production bowl turner, but I've been using it regularly for 10 years. Now, something I've never used on a bowl, but because I don't have bowls big enough, and of course, you know, that's a 5-inch palm sander. Other accessories are pneumatic. I don't use any pneumatic because, number one, you need to have a larger air compressor than I have. Mine's a fairly small compressor, and the compressor needs to be someplace where it's not going to startle you and make a tremendous amount of noise, which I don't have either. Something that can help out every now and then on a specialty sanding project of a small nature, and that's a rotary tool such as a Dremel or Black & Decker knockoff with a little sanding drum on it. They come in different sizes, and that can be very handy, especially if you do carving, or you're doing feed, or you've got some little special problem you need to tackle. Buffing can be a great way to do the final finish on your pieces. I've got a video, I've got a link below on the Beal buffing system. If that's of interest to you, just click on the link. If you have any favorite sanding techniques, leave your comments below, and if someone has a comment or a question, anybody can respond. You don't have to wait on me. Y'all can come on back here.